Just noticed in the credits that the person that I mentioned yesterday was credited, Rafael Evangelista from Campinas University. So it must have been made while he was a visiting professor at our center. I'd forgotten that. Okay, so first, tell me what happened. Hmm?
She killed herself at the end.
Okay, so you're going to tell me the end first? Yeah, okay. I think that's what we are supposed to assume. Yeah. Not a very cheerful way to start a class, but so what was going on in the video? Yeah.
Something that I understood was that the more technology was advanced, the more we were cold distant from each other. So she was a kind person. We could see that she helped a lot of people during the movie, but she couldn't find a real and a human connection. And okay, and the movie was advanced technology. I don't think we have this kind of technology nowadays. Yeah.
Pretty close.
But not that much, but we already feel this. For example, on Instagram, there are people who follow you and they like your posts, but they don't even say hi to you. You don't know these people in real life, and you're not connected to them. A human being. So that's something that I understand. I understood from.
Okay, great. Good little commentary. Others? Yeah.
The system that she is on, it's like the Chinese social credit system, like technology used to watch the citizens, not by the government, and didn't saw the video, but it's kind of the way things are working on.
Yep. So you could see some connections with social credit kinds of systems. Yeah, I mean that could have been all the way through actually. I was just thinking about the public transit system. So when she was on the bus and paid for somebody else, but yeah, it could still be a social credit kind of situation. Yeah, it's a good connection. Other thoughts on what you just saw?
Just like we talked before, they are reduced to numbers, and it's quite interesting that they don't have name in the movie. And in the bus, they gain bonus and like community cohesion bonus to their actions. So I do actually agree that it's pretty similar to the social credit. It was my first thought as the moment she was the elderly woman, the elevator. And it's pretty nice that they could make transactions for each other and other types of actions that gave those that kind of bonuses. But I don't agree with the presumption that she was a kind person, because you cannot understand if it was trying to cure herself and then made those actions, or the other way around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean she got up in the morning, did her exercising, but it was clear from the start that she had a plan and she knew where she was going. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Yeah. Mm. Yeah. He hesitated for long enough to tell us that he was concerned, but he, I don't know, didn't know how to intervene. And when he looked next, it was too late. Yeah. Then she didn't look back. Yeah. 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 It's, yeah. Mhm.
We are visible, but the people actually don't see us in the way that we are.
Mhm. Yep. Sorry, the payments, yeah.
Like, understand it because she was giving up away a lot of money, so I thought that maybe she had
Yeah.
money.
Yeah.
Let's move on.
Mm-hmm.
She was written on page, but the other second room, the second room was
I mean, it's silent as well. There, it's all open to interpretation, but it's interesting to know how you respond to something like that, um, especially in terms of the technological framing. The film is called Frames. The technological framing of the last few hours of this person's life, uh, because that's what it's all about. Yeah. Any other thoughts about the film?
trust that the video doesn't show technology that is particularly bad. Like, and they are supposedly good things, like that would help society, but sometimes it is not considered how these things may affect us personally or our relations. For example, social media, we often think of that as good things that will make us come together, but that also sometimes has very concerning effects on individuals.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. I mean that's a really good point. Um, and if the if this little movie is framed in terms of the smart city, then we might have some questions about how smart the city really is. Do you see what I'm saying? I mean, if a waiter gets a $5,000 tip, it's highly unusual, not to say bizarre. So if the city is so smart, then why would that not be recognized? Because it was part of a series of actions that were all to do with giving away money. And presumably her last thoughts in the morning were, I've got this much in my account. Before I do what I'm going to do, I'm going to give it away. So you wonder how smart the system really is. And I think that's what you're supposed to think. I mean, obviously, I was involved in making it. We discussed it quite a lot before the filmmaker made the film, and but the film answers to that question. Okay, if smart cities are so smart, why could they not recognize highly irregular behavior and create some alarm? Did you notice that the only alarm was large transaction in red, and then it turned to green when she confirmed or verified it, and end of story. It was still a ridiculously large transaction, even if it was verified. So, yeah. Anyway, a lot of smart city technologies have to do with discerning all kinds of situations, but including emotional behavior. And the capture of emotional data has become tremendously important. Obviously, in surveillance capitalism, you are wanting to know what, I mean, if you're a corporation, if you're a platform, you're wanting to know how potential consumers respond to advertising. And therefore, the emotional is very much part of what surveillance today is trying to capture. And that's why there is so much psychological research and neuroscience research going into surveillance systems, so that the human psychology and the neuroscience, the brain activities, are also up for grabs in surveillance activities. So, yeah, that film captures some of that. I suspect that the guy who hesitated really felt awful, especially when he discovered that he was right. But of course, it's not part of the movie, so we never know how he actually responded. But he looked such, I thought, a kindly gentleman who was obviously concerned with somebody who was wandering too close to an area where there was open ice on the water. You might not have been able to tell that because you don't live in Canada, but you watch out for the dark and light patches, and you can usually see where the soft ice is, or where the ice is that's not going to hold someone. This year in Ontario has been really bad for people going through the ice and losing their lives, because climate change has raised the general temperature, and we haven't had consistent enough cold weather to ensure that all river and lake ice is really good for winter activities. So yeah, that's an authentic bit of Montreal in the film too. Okay, well, you've seen two of the little films that we've made. I think you saw the little logo at the beginning of the of this show, which is Screening Surveillance. And the other two movies that we've made are freely available online, so you can just find them yourself if you're interested. One has to do with workplace surveillance. Oh, and the other one is really interesting too. It's the most recent one, and it's about some teenagers who engage in a new fad, a new activity called tres dancing. And what they do is video themselves working out dance routines in places where they are forbidden to be, where the signs all warn that you're not allowed to be in this place. And so it's kind of a daring thing, because they're doing their dance routines in places where it's not permitted to do them. So yeah, there's a bit of fairly low level law breaking in that film. So anyway, take a look, and if you if you do watch them, then you could always contact the person who directed the whole series. She is always keen to hear what viewers of the films think. I think I told you she's in educational technology at York University now, and at the time she was a postdoc with us. Okay, well, I'm going to continue with the smart theme, and we're going to switch to, oh, sorry about that. We're going to switch to some words from me, if I can remember my code for getting into this thing. At least it doesn't use my face. Yep. Okay, where were we? Yeah, and there's a little PowerPoint. Okay, and if you have more thoughts about the film, it's quite a haunting kind of film to watch. You might have further thoughts as we go along, but you're welcome to mention them if you wish. So, current surveillance challenges, AI, and the case of Israel-Palestine. Very early on in our sessions together, I asked whether you wanted to spend a lot of time on China, India, and the kind of huge country systems that have been set up. And I also said, well, we could also talk about the war in Gaza, and I saw a very different response. And so we're going to focus on the war in Gaza tonight. But first, I want to make some other points. Contemporary challenges, current challenges in the world of surveillance are frequently today clustered around artificial intelligence, machine learning, and so on. So it's a theme that has become tremendously important, and the fact that some are anxious about kind of Frankenstein sorts of fears of those self-automating technologies that take off in directions that we no longer can control, sort of dominate the popular headlines. But some of the questions that we need to ask are precisely about handing agency to machines. And it's a really important question in law, for example, when a number of lawyers working with technologists have raised questions about how far fairly straightforward situations can be addressed using AI, save a lot of legal employee time, save money to those who are using the law, and so on and so forth. So there are questions like, for example, determining whether someone's parole can end and they can be freer in the community. There are a number of kind of routine decisions that where people discuss the possibilities for AI applications that will reduce the need for human invention or intervention, or at least reduce the length of time that might have to be spent on some such intervention. As I've said in several of the talks, one of the real challenges that I think is tremendously important is the way in which AI, algorithms, and so-called big data, and along with that dataism, the belief in the efficacy of data to solve all sorts of human problems, these frequently end up with results, with consequences that are especially hit especially hard groups that are already vulnerable. in terms of class and race and gender in particular. The sorts of critiques that I've mentioned over the last couple of weeks, such as social sorting, the way that we are sorted by computer systems and put in categories that are produced by automated means, the way that that occurs is increasing. And they are such either in both Global South, Global North, and so on. Current queries also have popular resonance among younger generations and affected minorities. Big data and AI are seen in a number of application areas, some of which I've mentioned already, facial recognition, for example, including live facial recognition, and predictive policing, which we've also talked about, not at great length, but we have talked about it. But the other one is what we've just been watching, the idea of smart cities is another area in which vulnerabilities can be deepened as a result of so-called smart cities being established. Global competition involves many players, including the obvious ones that I've already mentioned, like China and India, in the forefront of some of these developments. India for the biometrics and China for things like the CCTV systems that were set up quite early on in this century, and the fact that they, like India, are trying to sell the systems that they have created to other countries. So these are all issues in contemporary surveillance using computerized systems. But we have to remember that AI itself is fundamentally surveillant. AI exists in a world of surveillance. The surveillance is not a special area of AI. AI is surveillant, period. AI applications rely on masses of data to train the algorithms, to recognize patterns, and to make decisions, like whether somebody should come off parole if you're a lawyer using a smart legal device. And much of these data has become very clear, even if it wasn't clear to you already, that huge amounts of data are collected from ordinary citizens, ordinary consumers, without us being aware of it, how much is collected, how sensitive it is, and so on and so forth. Internet companies track our clicks to divine our preferences for products, news articles, ads of all kinds. One example, if we're talking about facial recognition, major corporations like Clearview AI scrape images off major platform sites, and especially ones that have lots and lots of images for obvious reasons. In 2020, for example, the New York Times reported that Clearview had scraped billions of images off social media without any user consent, without even asking about user consent, let alone obtaining user consent. In the UK too, the Information Commissioner fined Clearview a large amount of money, but trivial compared with the size of Clearview. And in the US, there were lawsuits about Clearview. And Clearview is a company that works all over, including in this country, and other Latin American and Central American countries like Panama and the Dominican Republic and Mexico. And especially in that part of the world, there's a desire to use more intelligent computer architecture, especially for migrant populations trying to cross the border, particularly going north into the US. So facial recognition can be used by border agents, and there is some considerable enthusiasm among many border agencies to use AI. Facebook has announced that it'll train AI models with public video users with public video that users have uploaded onto the platform. Biometric recognition systems notoriously struggle to correctly recognize the faces of women and people of color. I've mentioned that a number of times, but it's a really serious issue, and it continues to be a really serious issue. And for that matter, oh, I actually moved this thing along. The false matches have been used in ways that have led to innocent people being jailed. So you get a false match within a smart system that is intended to automate the business of determining who are suspects or who are not, has led to innocent people being jailed. And there is also a growing impulse, as I said a few minutes ago, in the world of biometrics to try to identify people's emotions and other internal states based on their external experience. There was a situation a few years ago, can't remember which year it was, but anyway, right here in this state, and it was Via Quattro in Sao Paulo, and customers using the subway had no idea that the very tiny little camera on the doors of the subway was not just counting the number of people who were getting on and getting off and that sort of thing, but was geared to a number of different sorts of criteria that were being examined, including emotional states. Because they were connected also with advertising. So the camera was close to the little video on the door of the subway. And they were checking for emotional responses to the advertising that was occurring on the side of the subway train. And it was a very, very interesting example because what happened subsequent to that, there were a lot of customer complaints to Via Quattro, and the complaints got so numerous that other people joined in. So civil liberties groups joined in, and LAVITS that I've mentioned to you, the surveillance studies researchers across other countries as well as Brazil, but this was all Brazilians who were involved, also joined in to raise questions and to press the case as to how this was being done without any kind of permission of those whose images were being captured for those kinds of very intimate purposes, whether or not, of course, they were accurate in their understanding of the emotional states of Via Quattro riders is another matter. But there's an example in this country. And in fact, what happened was that Via Quattro had to take down the system and modify it so that there was much less data, and so the customers could also determine whether or not they were going to be captured. Their images were going to be captured on the system. So there's a good local example for you. And of course, the pandemic prompted a new phase of use of AI systems. I think I mentioned the other day that the Canadian government, public health in Canada, bought data, mobility data, from a telecom provider. And so there again, you see attempts to make smart systems operate, and in this case using data that no one had inquired about which no one had just inquired about the legitimacy of what was going on. By April 2021, the European Commission was presenting proposals to regulate risky uses of AI. And the idea was, for example, to ban remote facial recognition in public places for law enforcement purposes. In principle, they said, but it left some room for debatable cases when national law enforcement agencies were wanting to use the technology. So the key word here is, if you like, smart. That's the popular word for this. And smart systems have become a kind of catchphrase. And but this is what we're talking about. We're talking about machine learning and AI. One of the key aims of those kind of official key aims of people trying to set up AI systems is to overcome or avoid human error. It's kind of ironic, seeing as the systems frequently have errors. And the enthusiastic descriptions in the popular press and online try to give the impression that we're on the cusp of major shifts to AI. And it's true that there is a lot of pressure to develop AI systems, in the belief that AI can help human beings to be more efficient, more effective. Think of the words that are being used there again. Efficiency, effectiveness are seen as key criteria. What Amazon and Netflix and other corporations like that do in marketing also affects security. Surveillance systems that include video analytics analyze video footage in real time and can detect abnormal activities. Well, unless it was like frames that we just watched. That could pose a threat to the organization's security if it's an organizational matter. Essentially, video analytics technology helps security software to learn what is normal so that it can determine when there is something unusual or potentially harmful going on. And the claim is that humans alone may miss such things. And of course, there's a huge debate over, the accuracy of those kinds of statements. Why is it that we suddenly question the capacity of human beings to make judgments about unusual matters and assume that somehow AI can do better? And of course, in some contexts, that is exactly what's happening, but it tends to be in ones that involve far less complexity and far less nuance. the complex and the nuance are still pretty difficult for AI to work through. So what's new about this? Let me see. Yeah, here are a few things that we could say are new about AI surveillance. For example, it is forward-facing rather than only depending on past events, predictive policing being an obvious example. So very often surveillance has been backward-looking. What happened? What transpired? And then trying to understand it through surveillance. Prediction comes to be really significant with AI. And many things that are important for all our everyday lives. We've talked about privacy somewhat, but identity, democracy, knowledge, surveillance, all these things are significant. And again, I've talked about this a bit, but I'll just bring it in again. The idea of control, how far control is important with surveillance. I've pointed out several times that surveillance does not operate on its own. Surveillance is how we are recognized or how we are seen, but how we are seen then relates to how we are represented to those who are going to treat us in one way or another. So that little sequence is critical for all kinds of surveillance. And the old panopticon idea doesn't really help us there. The notion of control is really important, but also the predictive aspect is really important as well. So data collected from ubiquitous surveillance, surveillance that is everywhere, is fed into algorithms that are intended to make predictions about future behavior. ChatGPT, ChatGPT, obvious example. I mean, students are using ChatGPT in all kinds of ways. Some very intelligent and constructive ways, some considerably less so. But that is itself a predicting machine based on vast amounts of surveillance data. So if surveillance has a crucial forward-looking aspect as the driving force within machine learning and generative AI, then perhaps it's even time to start thinking about other ways of conceptualizing surveillance, especially when what has been fundamental about surveillance is in process of changing quite radically. Okay, there are lots of things that we can say here. Yeah, it's increasingly, AI surveillance is increasingly more privatized. Examples are primarily from corporate entities that often believe they have a right, even a duty, to collect and analyze data. Social inclusion depends increasingly on measurement, differentiation, hierarchy. Marianne Foucault talks about ordinal citizenship, our citizenship increasingly, or our citizenship experiences increasingly being dependent upon ordinals, on numbers, on empirical classifications. And basic human activities, communication, transaction, associating with each other, now depend on what Foucault and Johns talk about as loops, ladders, and links. References on there so you can check them out for yourself. But it also helps to determine our social positions and the possibilities that we have in life. Our life chances and our life choices are increasingly, with automated systems, becoming influenced, if not determined, in a strong way by these kinds of surveillance. Okay. Coming up to 7 o'clock. I don't know if you have any thoughts or questions or comments about what I've said. We could take a little break just now and then spend the rest of our time dealing with the Israel-Gaza war, if dealing with is a good word. Any thoughts on what I've been saying so far? I know there was also particular interest in our talking about machine learning and algorithmic surveillance in the form of artificial intelligence from those of you who are directly involved in legal studies. So if you have any comments or questions about that? Well, maybe not. Okay. Well, why don't we take 5 minutes and then we'll try to deal with some issues that relate to the Israel-Gaza war. And just a warning about this, I'm also going to insert a few little bits of biographical detail into, autobiographical detail into this, because you might wonder why I have a particular interest and have had a particular interest in this area for a very long time. So I decided to throw caution to the winds and tell you just a little bit about how my own biography fits with what we're going to be talking about. And if that is too self-absorbed for you, then I'll apologize in advance. Okay, 5 minutes break. Okay, I think everybody's back, aren't they? Yeah. Okay, so background to the Israel-Gaza war. It's a curious history. I don't know how much you know about the history. My father came from Scotland, and in Scotland, he was a member, his family was a member of a church which had links to a 19th century biblical scholar called J.N. Darby, who, among others, developed theories of Old Testament interpretation that suggested a Jewish return to Palestine. So it was kind of in my family history, this stuff. And these ideas became politically influential because they built on existing ideas about Palestine. If you go right back to the 18th century and the turn of the 19th century, Napoleon Bonaparte, who became Emperor of the Gauls, i.e. the French Empire, in 1804 saw a way of fending off British power in the region by offering Jews the hope of a return to Palestine. And of course, the very notion of a return to Palestine is highly problematic because Arab Palestinians had been living in Palestine for over a millennium, 1100 years. And before that, when there were some Jewish people there, it was that was also for a relatively long period, but it was before then. So it's got a long story. That didn't happen. There wasn't a return to Palestine in Napoleon Bonaparte's time. But the seed of the idea of a Jewish return to this part of the world had been sown, and it was taken up in a different context, England, by various groups, including some English aristocratic politicians, especially someone called Lord Shaftesbury. He believed that the restoration of the Jews to Palestine was predicted by the Bible, and that this happened to coincide quite handily with British foreign policy. Now, Napoleon's activities in the early 19th century related to what they then called the Eastern Question, i.e. which empire would control Turkey and North Africa. Basically, would it be French or would it be British? The French and the British had already fought battles over this question. One that centered in a place that in English was called Acre in Palestine, and the other in the Nile in Egypt. In 1839, this Shaftesbury character, who was a British aristocrat in political life, wrote an article arguing for a Jewish national homeland in Palestine that would still be under Turkish rule, but with British protection. Now, other aristocrats who were friends of this character, Shaftesbury, caught on to the idea, and Shaftesbury did his biblical homework by using the ideas that I mentioned right at the beginning, J.N. Darby and his interpretation of the Bible. But he also influenced, and here's the punchline, he also influenced a Jewish thinker called Theodor Herzl. And Theodor Herzl would become famous with his book, in German, Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state. And so there's a curious history between British biblical interpretation, aristocratic politics, and the ways in which the first Jewish people to think about a return to Palestine were actually building on Christian ideas from the Bible. So it's a really fascinating story. And not only did Shaftesbury help the Jewish enthusiasts to start thinking excitedly about return, he also supported another really important figure, James Arthur Balfour, another of these aristocratic characters who was called Lord Balfour. And he was behind the British Declaration in 1918, the Balfour Declaration. And he talked with Jewish leaders, and they all became very enthusiastic about the idea that there could be a Jewish presence in Palestine. And the declaration from Balfour stated that, quote, His Majesty's government, in other words, the King's government, accepts the principle of reconstituting Palestine as a national home of the Jewish people, and will discuss strategy with the Zionist organization. It was an organization by now. And Balfour also explicitly noted that they would not need to consult the existing Palestinian population about this. Why? Well, he said, quote, I don't think that Zionism will hurt the Arabs. But the idea, the meaning of this national home was never, ever clarified. Was it going to be a state? Who was going to have sovereignty? What was Jerusalem? What was Jerusalem's part in all this? Remember, there are three kinds of religious sites in Jerusalem: Jewish, Christian, and Muslim. And each one is very old. The Palestinians who were in the land at the time were 90% Arab, of whom 10% were Christian, but actual Palestinian people were not mentioned in the declaration. So it was about Palestine, but not about Palestinians. So the history is really interesting as a background to what has been happening over the last few months in particular. And I've put some of these things on the overhead for you. In 1921, think about this, Britain controlled 25% of the global land mass. The British Empire. And 458 million people were controlled by Britain in 1921. How many was that? 25% of the global population. These empires were pretty big and pretty strong. And this Britain, this imperial Britain, gave Zionism a kind of political legitimacy. And that Balfour Declaration from 1918 became the basis for the partition in 1947, and then the founding of the State of Israel, or the announcement of the coming into being of the State of Israel in 1948. There's another bit of biography there you must have worked out by now that I must have been born in 1948, so it's kind of been this way for the whole of my life. David Ben-Gurion, head of what was then called the Jewish Agency, declared Israel a state. It was a declaration that Israel was now a state. That was on May 14. And it was quickly recognized as such by European states and several European states and the US. But it also sparked the first Arab-Israeli war, which was to displace 750,000 Palestinians. So 750,000 Palestinians were displaced at that time. Including the person who was a colleague of mine that I'm going to come to in a moment. Israel calls this war the War of Independence, and the Palestinians still do refer to it as al-Nakba, the catastrophe. So two very different words, two very different ways of thinking about the same events. Then 1967, the Six-Day War involved Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and left most Palestinians under occupation or military control. So what I'm really saying is that if you say Israel-Gaza war, then to date that to October 7 is somewhat mistaken. This conflict did not start on October 7. It cannot be understood without going right back, I think, to 19th century history and so on. So, the Six-Day War involved Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and military control and occupation was there from then on. Several times, so-called two-state solutions have been proposed, but at the same time, especially under Benjamin Netanyahu, illegal settlements have mushroomed all over the place, and they're totally illegal because they're in the occupied territories, which is against all international law relating to war, occupations, and so on. Plus two intifadas, as they're called within the Palestinian community, 1987 to 93, 2001 to 2005, following which Israel erected its security barrier, which permitted easy Israeli travel and totally complicated travel for anyone who was not an Israeli. If you've been to Israel-Palestine, you will know all about that. But another important biographical background to my interest in Israel-Palestine is this. In 1985, I was still living in the UK. And while there, I started corresponding with someone called Ilya Zurich, just because he was interested in social and political aspects of new technologies, and I was getting really interested in that area as well. I can't remember how I came across his name. I can't remember anything really that led me to write to him or him to me. I don't know which way the which way it went. 1985. It's a year or two back. Anyway, we were already, each of us in our way, thinking about surveillance, at least in a rudimentary sense. We hadn't really studied it at the time. But later, to my surprise, I didn't know, it never occurred to me this would happen. We moved to Canada and to the university where he was teaching, and he became my colleague. And that was very interesting because when I first met him, he was already involved in the Oslo peace talks in 1992 and 1993. Because Ilya Zurich is a Palestinian. In fact, he was born in the place that I just mentioned, Acre, which is also known as Aku and Aka, depending on whether you speak Hebrew or Arabic. And so I had no idea that I was going to meet this character, but I did have some interest in Israel-Palestine already for certain reasons. And by 1993, we had arranged the very first international research workshop on surveillance studies. I'm not even sure that we called it surveillance studies at the time, but that's what we were doing. And then later planned a research workshop. And just see if I've got the... Okay, so that was Zurich's first book. He wrote The Palestinians in Israel, a study in internal colonialism. It was basically the first sociology of Palestine ever to be written, 1979. And he called what was happening there internal colonialism at the time. But out of that initial research workshop, several years later, we decided that it would be a really good plan to try to think about surveillance in Israel-Palestine. And so we organized a research workshop, which we held in Cyprus, so that the folks from the Israel-Palestine area could actually attend. They would never have gotten visas, and they wouldn't have been able to afford to fly to North America. So we held it in Cyprus. And that's the book that came out of it. This meeting was 2008, and the chapters in that book, Surveillance and Control in Israel-Palestine, which was edited by Ilya Zurich, me, and a colleague from the University of Alberta, Yasmin Abu Laban, contains some wonderful contributions. I won't dwell on the autobiographical here, but it was a wonderful research workshop, and the book I think is really good. And eventually, Ilya Zurich, by 2016, he'd already retired from the university by the time the book was coming out, wrote another book called Israel's Colonial Project in Palestine, Brutal Pursuit. So that's the one in the middle. And in this book, he argues very clearly that it's not just internal colonialism, it's settler colonialism. So like in Brazil, like in Canada, like in Australia, like in the United States, it's settler colonialism. But because it was such late settler colonialism, it had certain rather specific characteristics that distinguish it from earlier forms. But he argues in this book that it should be described as surveillance should be described as settler colonialism, sorry. And the third book in that trio that are on the screen now, the third one is called Decolonizing the Study of Palestine, and it has to do with how other people now understand Israel-Palestine because of the work that Zurich did. And so this is a Festschrift for him. Now, sadly, Elia Zurich died last year, January 2023, and so he actually never got to see the final version of the book. Although the final chapter in the book is by me, and because it was partly personal as well as academic, I did ask him to check it for me, and he approved my chapter. So, but that was a Festschrift for him. I don't know if you have come across Festschrifts. It's a German word that is basically celebrating a writer. Festschrift. And it's a, academic thing generally. It's a book that is written by colleagues to celebrate the work of someone who made a real contribution to academic life in some respect. So anyway, that book is all about, well, as it says, decolonizing the study of Palestine. Really interesting piece. Okay. The current Netanyahu government in Israel that maintains its position. You might wonder how and why a government can remain in power for so long, especially when, if you read the news, the prime minister is very, very, very unpopular. How does it happen? Well, it's because they have so many political parties in Israel, and the only way you can form a government is to find people who have sufficient votes who will agree to form a coalition. And so that's the way it operates. So you can have very minority governments who retain power for years and years, like Benjamin Netanyahu. So the provocation of increasingly significant growth of illegal settlements, for example, lived in by increasingly violent and law-resistant settlers. I mean, this is very well known, and lots of Jewish Israelis in Israel are extremely angry about the ways in which illegal settlements have been set up. This isn't something that Palestinians only are concerned about. It's so mistaken to think there are two positions in Israel-Palestine. There are so many positions. To talk about Israel and Israelis and Palestinians is simply a misnomer, because there are so many factions that, yeah, it's incredibly complicated. However, the life chances of ordinary Palestinians have become more and more difficult during the Netanyahu regime. On the other hand, Palestinians also have great resilience and a great sense of humor. Do you know the British artist Banksy? That name mean anything? Oh yeah, you know about Banksy. Okay. Well, let me tell you, in Bethlehem, i.e. West Bank, or part of Palestine, there is a hotel that Banksy helped to bring into being, and a lot of Banksy's work is in there, as well as on the security fence, which is the huge concrete wall now dividing Israeli from Palestinian territory. And this hotel is called the Waldorf Hotel. Now, in English or American English, Waldorf is a very important hotel chain. But the difference here is it's a walled off hotel. And so you have Banksy humor right in the middle of one of the most excruciatingly difficult circumstances in the world, where you have a security fence and you have people not even being able to get to their own families without extreme difficulty just because of this wretched security fence. Anyway, the Waldorf Hotel is a place of great humor and comedy. And it's marvelous. There's a history of Israel-Palestine right inside the hotel, and you can learn a serious history of the conflicts and so on and so forth. But there are also lots of artifacts and lots of Banksy type pictures in there. So Palestinians have a great sense of humor as well. I suppose biographically, I should mention that I've been an invited professor at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and I've also taught a course at Birzeit University in Ramallah. So I have experience in academic life in each of those places. So, as I say, the brutal and horrible Hamas attack on October the 7th has to be seen in the context of all that has happened since 1948, and actually since 1918, and actually since Napoleon Bonaparte was around, because that's where the first ideas of having a return, a Jewish return to Israel came from. And of course, the factor that made it possible and drove governments to support the idea of a Jewish return to Palestine was European guilt over the Holocaust. And, you know, that is perfectly true to this day. And let's face it, even for young people, as Sue and I once were, we were appalled to grow up realizing that such things as the concentration camps and the murders of Jewish people in Germany. We spent quite a few trips when we were in the 1970s going to look at what had been turned into museums, the concentration camps where people died. So we visited Auschwitz and Mauthausen and a whole number of other places. So that was also biographical, because we felt it important enough to try to understand what the previous generation had not understood, namely what had actually happened in those ghastly concentration camps, the Holocaust, as the Israelis call it. So, yeah. So the context has to come first. And now I'm coming to the AI connections and the surveillance connections, but I thought it was quite important to try to set some kind of a picture. And as you can hear, I am not someone who is simply partisan, arguing for either Israel's right to do what it's currently doing, or Palestinians' right to resist it, because it's a very, very complex situation, and there is much right and much wrong in every department. Of course, October the 7th was a huge shock to Israelis, who had been told that their so-called Iron Dome electronic defense system would protect them from any attack. And even their supposedly foolproof on-the-ground intelligence surveillance that led to the production of intelligence information would warn them of any attack. So, yeah. As you can see, I'm very tempted to say more, but there are so many things that one can say about these matters. The Iron Dome itself is believed in so strongly by Israeli people who think that it really is a foolproof system for deflecting any rockets from Gaza. And, our Israeli friends, just about every home in in Israel has some kind of bomb shelter. And so, our friends have a place in the home where the structure of the building is such that there is a strong room on the ground floor or just below ground where families can go if a rocket comes. So it's, Israel is very well prepared in that sense. As I say, dependence on the Iron Dome is widespread. But the conditions in the life of both the West Bank and Gaza have been deteriorating at an accelerating pace over recent years. If you live in a 35 or 40 kilometer strip of land with 2.3 million other people, when you're unable to travel or enjoy the lifestyles of those who are just on the other side of the fence, and in fact already have very poor conditions in terms of normal food consumption, medical care, schools and universities, and employment possibilities, then an explosion at some point is at least predictable, even if not justifiable. So let me comment now on the surveillance aspects that I believe are hugely important, and I really do rely on my colleagues' work in this. Sure, we did lots of things together, but this is very much his analysis in the Israel's Colonial Project in Palestine book. His argument that it is 21st century forms of surveillance, 20th century when 20th century was still around, but they have always wanted to work out, the Israelis always wanted to work out the most high-tech means of providing surveillance as protection against what they thought of as the possibility of Palestinian attack. So, and in part, now I don't know where I am in these slides. Okay, so the name of the person that I'm partly depending on in writing this is somebody called Sophia Goodchild. So her name is near the bottom there. She's a researcher on Israel-Palestine, but particularly about surveillance, and she has some great articles. She's a very reliable researcher, but a very passionate one too. In fact, excuse me, her PhD supervisor was an American Israeli scholar at Duke University. Back in 2021, the Israeli Defense Forces announced that they had waged the world's first AI war, the 11-day offensive on Gaza, codenamed Operation Guardian of the Walls, which, according to B'Tselem, which is a Jewish Israeli human rights group, and don't imagine there aren't really good human rights groups in Israel. There are. And no one should be in any doubt about them. And B'Tselem is one of the most prominent ones in the care that they give to their work and so on and so forth. Anyway, that Operation Guardian of the Walls killed 261 and injured 2,200 Palestinians. Drones being used by the Israelis were wiping out entire families, damaging schools and medical clinics, exploding high-rise buildings in some that were home to families, businesses, and media offices, far from any military targets. At that time, 72,000 Palestinians were displaced and thousands more mourned the dead. And Israeli generals boasted that they had revolutionized warfare. AI was a force multiplier for the IDF, officials bragged, detailing how robotic drone swarms amassed surveillance data, pinpointed targets, and dropped bombs with minimal human intervention. Okay, so we're talking machine learning and AI in the context of surveillance and warfare here. And the pattern repeated itself a little over a year later. In August 2022, the IDF launched a 5-day offensive on Gaza named Operation Breaking Down, which took the lives of 49 Palestinians, including 17 civilians. Missiles exploded on the streets of Jabalia refugee camp, killing civilians driven from their homes because of power outages. Drones also struck a nearby cemetery, taking the lives of children playing in a coveted strip of open space. The ubiquity of AI warfare, both the weaponry and the intelligence gathering and the surveillance, does not mean, of course, that somehow these technologies should be developed or deployed without safeguards and limitations. Algorithms may indeed make many aspects of warfare more efficient, from guiding missiles to sifting through data to monitoring border crossings. Yet experts list a whole litany of dangerous posts by these systems, among which, in relation to our earlier discussion, digital dehumanization that reduces human beings into lines of code for a machine to determine who should live or who should die, to a lowered cost and threshold for warfare that replaces ground troops with algorithms. So the surveillance and the means of warfare are very much linked together. And indeed, major surveillance production companies in Israel are nearly always run by former IDF officers. So the Israeli Defense Force officers, as with many military personnel, retire early. So they're still in their 40s or early 50s, and they go off to start to make startups. And there are many examples of this. So things learned from the military context get recycled into the development of new kinds of surveillance and weaponry as well, but the surveillance is especially important because it's the surveillance equipment that is then sold around the world. And so Israeli surveillance equipment companies like the NSO group, for example, is responsible for huge sales all the way around the world. And yeah, one journalist pointed out in relation to Gaza today, with a population of, I'm quoting, with a population of 2.3 million people in an area less than 45 kilometers, Gaza is one of the most densely populated places in the world. No matter how advanced the technology is used, each Israeli bombardment on the Strip takes the lives of countless innocent bystanders. Civilians are often caught in the crossfire, and it's virtually inevitable. And the Israeli army itself doesn't seem concerned about the pace of AI development. They encourage it. They talk about using chat GPT in numerous areas. And they, well, there's a colonel from the IDF who is in charge of the new research and information, AI research and information unit. And he said there is a limit to your capacity as a human being. If you sit down to process the information for a week, you might come to exact the same conclusion. But a machine that can do it in a minute, can do in a minute what would take you a week is the one for me. So the techno-optimism that I've spoken about in several evenings is very clearly visible in the IDF and in the offshoots, the spin-offs that have appeared, especially in the Israeli surveillance companies. Commanders of elite intelligence units have self-published tracks embracing what they call human-machine synergy. Others hold key positions in arms companies like Elbit Systems. I said it was both weapons and surveillance systems. And when 60 countries, including China and the United States, penned a largely symbolic call to action endorsing the responsible use of military AI in February last year, Israel refused to sign the statement. Instead, high-ranking commanders compare killer robots to chatbots and come out with Silicon Valley type language from tech executives who say that AI will only enhance human life. So the breadth of destruction in a besieged Gaza makes such claims harder and harder to believe. If the latest bombardment is revealing anything, it's that even the most technologically advanced weaponry cannot offset the human cost of warfare, no matter how sophisticated the algorithms are. And that human cost of warfare is seen perhaps above all in what's left of the hospitals. I don't know if you've ever come across somebody called Mads Gilbert. He's a Swedish doctor who has spent a lot of his life volunteering in hospitals in Gaza. Anyway, Gilbert, Mads Gilbert, really worth reading. He has been back in Gaza during the war, and I heard him speak in Doha, Qatar, just a few weeks ago. And he was describing in the most vivid and horrendous details what he was seeing in the hospitals. He's somebody who's totally committed to peace between Israel and Palestine and to access to proper medical attention for so many people that need it right now. One of the greatest myths about artificial intelligence, I think, is that it is an objective or a neutral tool. I've made this observation before. There is no such thing as an objective or neutral tool. They're all made for some purpose or another, and they all fulfill some purpose or another, even if it's not the purpose for which they were originally intended to be used. Either way, there is no neutral or objective tool. AI is shaped by all sorts of things, economic pressures. In Israel, the desire to retain control by Israelis over all of the land that they call Israel, and which increasingly frequently seems to include both the West Bank and Gaza. I mean, there's a reliable photo of Benjamin Netanyahu holding a map of Israel in, I think it was August last year. And on that map of Israel, there is no Gaza and no West Bank. So you can draw your own conclusions as to what he might think about that, but it's a reliable photo that I've seen. So, as I said earlier, popular magazines, high-tech magazines like Wired magazine, will proclaim that AI has a great new role in humanizing life. And if what I've just been saying has any truth in it, as I believe it does, something pretty close to the opposite is true. The dangers of dehumanization are very high indeed, partly because our understanding of the human has become so demoted and diluted. The relational, in particular, that I, for one, consider to be one of the most profoundly important of all human characteristics, that we are relational beings, has been diminished in an era of rampant individual remote connectedness. And this is seen also, it's reflected in AI and machine learning. So there's there's my finishing point, which is the same as my starting point. I want to argue that there is a case to be made for technologies, including, and maybe especially including, surveillance technologies, to be attuned to conceptions of the human that are really worthy of human beings in all the nobility and complexity of human beings. And that while we still have techno-optimists telling us that the world's problems are going to be solved by some new technology, especially currently machine learning and AI, it seems to me, especially if we look at what I've just been talking about, it's bad news for those humans. So at this point, clearly, I am arguing a case that you may not agree with, but like any professor who believes that their role is in part a public role and not just a private role in, I don't know, writing articles and books, doing research, teaching students or whatever, that those of us who are privileged to be university professors also have a responsibility to actually come out and say among students and in our, the op-eds we write in the newspaper and the interviews that we give to radio and TV and so on. I think we have to be quite clear, especially when the stakes are so very high. That's where I stand. And if you like, there's the end of the kind of biographical leanings, because you can hear, I hope, that my own life experience has brought me into some very close relationships with people who are concerned not just with surveillance in general, but very particular circumstances of surveillance, in this case in Israel, Palestine. It does not at all diminish my vast respect for so many Israeli intellectuals, university professors, and many people. There are many Israelis who have no sympathy at all with the current war. There are many, of course, who are affected by the loss of the hostages or the non-return of the hostages, and that's fully understandable. And of course, as I already said, the attacks on October the 7th were horrendous, and I'm not pretending that they weren't either. Whether killing 29,000 Palestinians is an appropriate response is a question for you to answer. But yeah, so we've gotten ourselves into pretty serious matters this evening, and but it's not the last night. We've got another night to come. So, you know, I wanted to do it in this order because I'm hoping that we'll be able to talk about, okay, what are the real alternatives and how are you going to continue in this world? You're much younger than I am. 75 years old, as you gathered. And unfortunately, my days are numbered. Yours are ahead of you. And the responsibility for matters like this and other huge ones like climate change that we were talking about earlier are the world that you're going to experience for much longer than I am. So I make no apologies for what I've been saying, but I do hope that you'll be able to respond and tell me where you think I'm wrong, because I've also been a professor all my life who has asked students to tell me when they think that I am wrong, because I am also a human being and a frail and fallible one at that. So I make no pretense that I'm some kind of professor who knows everything or gets everything right. I don't, and I don't. So you can help me, but I cannot but present you all with the kind of challenges that I've been doing this evening and over the past 7 lectures. Did you anybody want to respond right away or make any comments about this evening? The alternative in any case is that we can use a bit of time tomorrow. I'm very happy to devote as much time tomorrow to your questions and to your feedback and so on. In fact, if you want to, you know, write down this evening or tomorrow sometime what you think you've learned from being in our company for the last couple of weeks, it would be super helpful, I think, for everyone to hear, and certainly for me. It's all too easy to have a course and never really get a sense of feedback from the students as to what was worthwhile and valuable and what they could have done without hearing, or they would prefer not to have been confronted with. So if you would like to write some things down, I'd be very, very grateful. And then we can talk about those tomorrow. And if you've learned nothing at all, then you won't have much of a, you know, task before you. So that will be up to you. Okay, I think we're up to time, really, aren't we? So yeah, feedback, interaction tomorrow. It's our last opportunity, and I want it to be your opportunity. I've done a lot of talking. In fact, I think something funny's happened to my voice this evening because I've done too much talking. So you can take over tomorrow and do some talking, and I'd be very grateful for that. So that is tonight. Tomorrow is tomorrow. I hope you have a good evening and a good day tomorrow until we meet on, what time is it? 6 o'clock. Okay, great. Thanks so much.